treatment or moderate physical pressure, right? Inhumane and degrading treatment, these 5 techniques do not constitute torture, right? These coercive interrogation tactics are different from torture, which we know is false. And they say that the argument was that these do not constitute a legitimate claim that torture was used, right? Rather, it was the denial, the process of denial was interpreted. This is a form of interpretive denial. The process of denial reinterpreted the act as, quote, inhumane or degrading treatment or even moderate physical pressure. So I want to read this section actually from the book because there was a piece before it just to sort of situate this. All right, it's very important. It's very important to recognize the next bit, and I'll read it from the book. This is again from Human Rights in the World Community, and I'm reading from page 87. I just want to read this little blurb before I jump to the next section in the notes. So just listen along. It was too much for me to type. The report. This is going to summarize what I just read. The report produced by the Landau Commission was path-breaking in a number of ways. It confirmed that, in fact, GSS agents, I quoted this part, GSS agents had used violent interrogation methods routinely on Palestinian detainees since at least 1971, and that they had routinely lied about their practices when confessions were challenged in the court on the grounds that they had been coerced. The Landau Commission was harsh in its criticism of GSS perjury, but adopted the GSS own position that coercive interrogation tactics were necessary in the struggle against quote-unquote hostile terrorist activity. The Landau Commission accepted the broad definition of terrorism utilized by GSS, which encompassed not only acts of threats of violence, but virtually all activities related to Palestinian nationalism. Thus was born the euphemism of moderate physical pressure, which was not considered to be torture, right? So it was an interpretative denial of the acts as acts of torture, and instead it was considered moderate physical pressure. The Landau Commission had adopted an apocalyptic view of the world, where nothing less than the survival of the Israeli state and the Jewish nation were deemed to be at stake in the interrogation of quote-unquote hostile terrorists, right? So I cite that last bit in the last bullet point, right? So it's important to recognize that what ended up happening was the commission, again, quote on page 13, last bullet point, the Landau Commission had adopted an apocalyptic worldview. That might seem like a really simple concept, but what you recognize is if your government officials adopt this polemic, apocalyptic, sort of doomsday scenario, wherein one state is overwhelmingly going to defeat another, and there's not going to be any balance, and it ends in this apocalyptic worldview, then its reactions and its actions in the world are going to be informed by that, right? If I have, the technical term is eschatology, and you know, it would be interesting to do a series on eschatology, but if I have an eschatological belief system, meaning that I believe that the world is going to end in an apocalyptic sort of doomsday scenario, then that particular worldview is going to inform how I interpret actions in the world. Obviously, it's going to escalate my interaction with what I perceive to be hostile or potentially hostile combatants, right? So the Landau Commission has adopted an apocalyptic worldview where nothing less than the survival of the Israeli state and the Jewish nation deemed to be at stake in the interrogation of hostile terrorists. I just read that from the book. It concluded that survival and security trump other value considerations, and this is important, right? Torture assumes, right? It assumes, right? It assumes that national security and survival of the state trump other valued considerations, right? National security it assumes that national security and state survival, the word that the author used was trump, T-R-U-M, trump valued considerations. Right? Torture assumes that national security and state survival trump valued considerations. If we are going to buttress our justification of torture on the assumption that insofar as we are torturing these detainees, we are doing so in the name of national security, then it had better be the case that that act doesn't in fact undermine national security, right? Because if your justification, and it's very simple, I hope this is clear, right? If your justification is the reason why we are participating in an act of torture is in the defense of national security, then the act of torture had better defend national security. What we have seen time and time again is that the torture of detainees, in this example in the Landau Commission report, the conflict between Israeli and Palestinians has only escalated since the time of the report. It's still probably one of the longest standing conflicts, global conflicts. There hasn't really been much resolve to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? So the fact that you're torturing is actually undermining the security of the nation. If we look at the leak of the events from Abu Ghraib in the United States scandal that just galvanized the world against the United States, unfortunately. Hopefully that has been somewhat reversed, but everyone was like, look at what's going on, right? How did that help our national security? It didn't help our national security, right? It can't help U.S. national security for that information to be leaked to the public, right? And not only to be leaked to the public, it cannot help our national security for that practice to happen in the first place, right? So the whole point is, if you attempt to legitimize the act of torture as a defense of national security and state survival, then you have to recognize, I've given a number of examples now, that it in fact doesn't, right? It does not help. It is not a good source to protect the nation. And I've given, again, several counterexamples to the fact, right? So, last little bit on the very bottom of page 13, last sentence. Right on its own terms, the Landau Commission report is a blueprint for what is known as absolute security, right? And I'm not going to get into this too much. Right? Absolute security. And the truth is that absolute security can never be attained. No nation can attain absolute security. Absolute security can be set, can be posited as the goal, right? We want to secure our borders as such. If, this is sort of the rhetoric in American contemporary immigration policy, blah, blah, blah. But in reality, there is no way to absolutely secure the border. If you really aspire and hope to attain absolute security at the expense of human rights, especially human rights for individuals who have been systematically, strategically targeted, then you have to recognize that you will never approximate absolute security. In fact, absolute security will be the antithesis of what you will approximate, which is a destabilized state. Right? So we have absolute security on the one hand as one pole, and on the other you can have a destabilized, or actually a fully collapsed, C-O-L-L-A-P. Right? Absolute security as an extreme, destabilized collapsed state as another extreme, and really what we have in between are sort of gradations of security. The centerpiece being a moderately, stable state, more secure state, less secure state, destabilized, fully collapsed state, absolute security, unattainable, right? Not an attainable state of protection. As a matter of fact, my wife and I wrote a book, and it's at the press now, and its final revisions have been approved by the editors and the review committee, and I talk, hopefully it comes out It comes out soon. I'm really, and it's not a